Okay, and this is an interactive learning community, so we will have a portion for breakout groups. And this is our opportunity for discussion. So please feel free to leave your webcam on and have your microphone on. And if you ever need assistance or have any questions, use the chat and we will have people monitoring that. Okay, and then if you would like to rename yourself to your name and then your title and where you're from, your organization, feel free to do that. I'm sure everyone knows how to do that by now by just clicking on your picture. All right, and I will pass it over to Jen, Dr. Hall-Landy, who is our facilitator today, and I'll read a quick bio on her. Dr. Hall-Landy is a researcher and psychologist with a specialty in early identification of developmental delays and disabilities. She leads the Autism and Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network and Minnesota ACT Early Project. She's also a faculty in our Minnesota LEND program. Welcome, Dr. Hall-Landy.
Thank you so much, Courtney, and welcome to everyone else. It's so nice to see all of you again on this warm spring day. I hope everybody is doing okay after those storms last night. At least in the Twin Cities, we had some pretty significant storms and some branches down. So hope everyone's doing okay. Again, it is great to see you. As Courtney said, this is Project SCOPE, which stands for Supporting Children of the Opioid Epidemic. Our goal here today is to have a community of practice of early intervention providers supporting children and families who are affected by the opioid epidemic. We use an ECHO virtual training model, and that stands for, next slide, please. Oh my. ECHO stands for Extension for Community Health Outcomes. And we cover this every week because we use this model, and it has a few key tenets. One, we promote health equity. Two, we share knowledge and expertise, and we say it's bi-directional. We bring speakers, experts, family members here to share their stories, and we hope all of you will share with us what some of your experience and knowledge is as well. So the direction, the knowledge, it goes two ways. We share and we learn together. We want to provide healthcare without barriers, and I know being on Zoom and being virtual is no longer a rare thing, but just to give you a little bit of history, and I said one day I would give a little bit more history, this model really evolved. I can't remember, Rebecca, do you remember the year? You feel free to chat it in, that the ECHO model started, but the origins of it were
2003.
2003. So that was well before we were used to these virtual platforms. It was started by a liver doctor in New Mexico. His name is Dr. Sanjeev, I think, Ancora, and he was a specialist in liver disease. And what he continued to see were patients that couldn't make the trek to him at the University of New Mexico. For some, it was a 5-6 hour drive. And so he had knowledge and could even help patients, families that were affected by, for example, hepatitis C. But the issue was access, and sort of one of the final straws for him to increase access was a 43-year-old mother that came to him with hepatitis C that now had advanced stage liver disease. And when he asked her, why didn't you come? I could have cured you of this. I could have given you the treatment you needed. She said it was too long of a drive. She couldn't afford to take the day off, 5 hours. And she ultimately wound up dying. And because of that, he said, this in the United States, this is no excuse. We need to bring care to the people. We need to democratize healthcare. So he started a model, the ECHO model, and he shared his expertise and knowledge with doctors in the community, a hub and spokes model, trained them. His waiting list went from 8 months to 2 weeks after he had it well established. So those doctors were able to treat patients in the community. And so he took this model and we now use it in many, many different arenas. Today, we're talking about opioids, but there are ECHO models on cancer and HIV and diabetes, and all of it is to take knowledge and share and also learn from people that are participating as well out in the community. So that was my little background story. Feel free to look at it. It's a very compelling story, and I've only given you just a little bit of it. But our goal is to really bridge healthcare and education. couple principles: we use technology as we're doing today. We use best practices to reduce health disparities. Again, knowledge should not be centered in university centers or urban areas, but should be shared. We always do a case study or family story, and we use data to monitor outcomes. Next slide, please. Here's our session today. Thank you again for joining us. We're going to talk today about the understanding of ACEs, trauma, and resilience for healing in Indigenous communities. Look at our future ones. Next week, we'll be talking building recovery capital across the continuum, and then child welfare systems impacts. And then we're going to have some neonatologists come in, some community organizations come in. So it will be a lot of great sessions yet to come. But today, we're very excited for our current speaker, and I have the privilege to introduce Susan Beaulieu. And I'm going to read it. I have a paper here, so you're probably seeing me read off a paper. Susan is with the University of Minnesota's College of Pharmacy. Susan is an Anishinaabe citizen of the Red Lake Nation and has been working with tribal communities for the past 14 years in a variety of capacities, including project development, training development, and facilitation. She currently works as an extension educator for the University of Minnesota Extension, which is a wonderful organization, providing resources. That was my editorial, Susan. Providing resources and support to tribal nations and communities around the state of Minnesota on topics including trauma and toxic stress, ACEs, epigenetics, neuroscience, resilience, and healing. Susan is pursuing her PhD in social and administrative pharmacy at the University of Minnesota College of Pharmacy and received her master's in public policy from the University of Minnesota's Hubert H. Humphrey Institute. Yay, you are quite a gopher here. Lots of University of Minnesota credentials here. We love it. Susan was a 2016 Bush Leadership Fellow focused on learning about generating healing and well-being at the individual and collective levels. She's a mother of 4 and resides with her family in the Brainerd Lakes area. Thank you for coming, Susan. We welcome you, and we very much look forward to hearing your presentation.
Yeah, miigwech. Thank you so much. I'm wondering, is there a way that I can drive my own slides today?
Yes, I think I just allowed you to have remote control, so you should be good to go.
Yeah, it's weird. I see it, but it's not.
Courtney, if you stop sharing, maybe that'll help.
Oh. So I am not good with technology. I'm good with a lot of things, but technology is not one of them. And the irony is my husband works in IT. So anyway, okay, I think it's working now. There's a bit of a lag. Great. Okay, so thank you for the really warm welcome and the invitation to come and speak today. I'm gonna try hard not to talk too fast, because usually when I do this presentation, it usually is anywhere from 1.5 hours to 2 hours. So I had to pare it down, but I also want to make sure that I bring in some of the practices that I found personally really helpful, and the people that I work with across the state have found these practices really helpful as well. And we'll talk more about why in a bit. But let's start with a soft belly practice. So I was trained through the Center for Mind Body Medicine, and this is a really foundational practice. Our breath is the most powerful tool we have to regulate our nervous system. And so soft belly breathing is a really simple way to activate the parasympathetic nervous system. So I'd invite you to just get your body into a comfortable position, whatever that feels like for you. If closing your eyes feels good, you can close your eyes. Otherwise, just having a soft gaze down at whatever's in front of you, minimizing visual distractions. And so as you begin breathing in through the nose, bringing that breath deep into the belly, imagining the belly is like a balloon, that as you inhale in through the nose, you're expanding that balloon out. And then as you exhale out through the mouth, that balloon in the belly deflates. And so just breathing at whatever pace feels good for you, but remembering to bring that breath deep into the diaphragm. And if it's helpful for you, you can think to yourself, soft as you breathe in and belly as you breathe out, to remind yourself to keep your belly nice and relaxed, allowing that air to come deep into the diaphragm. And it can also help you keep your focus, because our minds tend to wander. They're used to wandering and going where they want to go, thinking about what they want to think about. And so sometimes saying to yourself, soft as you breathe in through the nose and belly as you breathe out through the mouth, helps you to keep your focus and attention on your breath. We'll take just a few more big, soft belly breaths. And then when you feel ready to come back into this space fully, if you had your eyes closed, you can go ahead and open your eyes. And I invite you just to take a moment checking with your body in this moment. How does your body feel? Checking in with your emotions, checking in with your thoughts, how quickly or slowly they're moving. And also checking in with your sense of connection to self and to others. So just checking in with these different parts of who we are. That is not what I wanted to do. Okay. So today we're going to do a really brief overview of historical trauma and some of the impacts on Indigenous communities. Today we're going to talk about epigenetics and intergenerational trauma. I'll do a high overview of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. We're going to talk a little bit about the nervous system, the different parts of the autonomic nervous system, and what happens when we move into that stress response and with toxic stress. We'll talk a little bit about trauma and the developing brain, and then we're going to look at some resilient strategies. I'm sorry, I'm so used to using my mouse to move stuff forward, but it's only letting me use my keyboard. So I apologize every time that pops up. Here we go. Okay, so these are two gentlemen who have really shaped how I view trauma. Over the last couple of years, I've been able to read a lot of books, sit in on sessions with them, take classes with them. The gentleman on the left of the screen is Thomas Hübl, and the gentleman on the right is Dr. Gabor Mate. And Dr. Gabor is really known for his work around adverse childhood experiences, the connection to addiction and substance use issues. And Thomas Hübl is known for his training and his insights into understanding how trauma impacts us at an individual level, at the collective level, and the ancestral level, that it's all interconnected. And one of the things that they both say is that trauma is not necessary, it's not what happens to us, it's what happens inside of us when whatever the traumatic event is, when we don't have either the individual resources internally or the relationships and the community externally to help us navigate and move through that big energy of trauma when it happens, then that trauma energy gets stuck. And it's when that energy gets stuck, either in the physical body, which after a stressful day or week, you might notice stress in the body, tension, headaches, tight shoulders, all of that. That's the body holding stress. So there are different ways that the mind, the body, the emotions, and the spirit hold stress and trauma energy. And so it's more about what happens inside of us and that inability to allow that energy to move through. Oh, I just did it again. Let's see. Okay. So this is actually a diagram that Thomas Hübl shared in one of the classes I recently took with him, and it's from Dr. Stephen Porges. I'm such a visual person. This graph has been so helpful even for me to understand sort of the different parts of our nervous system and where we might find ourselves. So the green on the bottom is when we're in that ventral vagal part of our nervous system. We feel joy, we feel connection, we feel open, we feel curious. It's a really it feels good to be in this place. Now, when our nervous system perceives a threat, it could be a physical threat, it could be an emotional threat, it could be a mental threat. When a threat is perceived, we start to get aroused and we start to move into the sympathetic nervous system. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But when we move into that sympathetic nervous system, we either move away from, so this movement away from whatever the threat is, so that's the flight response. And with that can come emotions of panic, fear, anxiety, worry, and concern. Or we might move towards the threat, like I can deal with this. But with that might come emotions like rage, anger, irritation, frustration. If we can't run and if we can't fight our way out of whatever the threat is, the next best option, and this is not a conscious choice we make, but the next best option for the body and for survival is to go into shutdown, to go into that freeze dissociative state. We'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. But with that comes feelings of dissociation, disconnection, shame, numbness, depression, feeling hopeless and trapped, shut down. And so even though it looks on the outside like a less activated state, it's actually more activating than when we're in that the just fight or flight response itself. And so the goal is to figure out, how do we recognize what part of our nervous system are we in, and then 2, what are some practices and strategies and tools and relationships that can help us be able to shift back into the ventral vagal part of our nervous system. And so we don't have time necessarily to have the conversation about this, but I invite you just to think for a minute. What do you know about historical trauma in Indigenous communities in the United States? And if you don't know a lot of this isn't taught in our school systems, right? Some of this is starting to be taught, but I honestly didn't learn about most of this until I started college. And even in college, it was a few classes, just a tiny bit of it. So unless you have your own like curiosity, and there's a lot of resources now, but there haven't been for most of, for many, many years, there were not a lot of resources for people to really learn and understand what happened to Indigenous people here in the United States. And so this is a definition of historical trauma. And Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, who is Lakota, coined the term historical trauma. And she says it's the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations that emanates from massive group trauma. So this is different than, and we'll talk a little bit later about intergenerational trauma. Historical trauma is more about what happens to a whole population, to a group of people. And I think this is important because if in a society, trauma impacts a family, that society, that community can still come around that person, that family, and help support them and move through that trauma. But when the trauma is happening to the whole community, and when many of the practices that Indigenous people had to be able to navigate and move through trauma were made unavailable for a variety of reasons we'll talk about in a little bit, then that means a lot of that trauma ended up getting stuck. So we weren't able to individually and collectively move through that cumulative wounding. And so again, this is a super high overview. We literally could spend years really digging into all of these pieces, but thinking about things like warfare and genocide. So there were not, they didn't have censuses back then, but the estimates are anywhere between 15 and 35 to 40 million Indigenous people in the contiguous United States pre-contact. And around 1900, that number of Indigenous people in the contiguous United States hovered around 250,000. So you go from millions and millions and millions of Indigenous people down to 250,000 people. And so some of that had to do with a lot of I knock on wood, we're not through the pandemic yet, but we are coming out of, hopefully, a pandemic. And so when groups don't have immunities to the diseases that are coming through, it can really wipe out a large percentage of the population. So that was part of it. The other piece of it was literally just outright warfare. Tribes were on lands that they wanted for water, for minerals, for different resources, timber and things like that, gold. And so sometimes tribes were just outright eliminated, murdered, because they wouldn't get off the land. But then you also have this whole piece around removal and relocation. And so there's one famous relocation story that a lot of schools do teach about, and that's, of course, the Trail of Tears. But the thing that they don't teach, that I didn't learn about until much later, was that the Trail of Tears included primarily 5 tribes from the southeastern part of the United States. So like North and South Carolina, Florida, sort of that area down there. And it involved what they called the 5 civilized tribes. And they call them civilized because they got baptized, they wore white clothing, they spoke English, they went to school, they became farmers, they lived in houses, they did all the things they were told they needed to do to assimilate. And in the end, Andrew Jackson said it didn't matter. All Indians needed to be removed west of the Mississippi. And so that's how the Trail of Tears came about. And many, many people lost their lives on this 2,000-mile trek from the East Coast to Oklahoma. And actually, Oklahoma was originally set up to be the Indian state. They were going to try to move all Native people from the United States to Oklahoma to contain them there, which is why you see today in Oklahoma lots of tribes that did not originate in that area. They originated on the coast or other parts of the United States, but they were removed there because that's what they were trying to do, is move everyone there. And one of the things I like to remind people of is, I don't know if you've ever been to North Carolina and or Oklahoma. I've never been to Oklahoma. I've seen pictures. I have been to North Carolina. And what I know is they are very, very different places ecologically. They have different plants, they have different animals, they have different resources. And so when you as a people are used to, like, you know what the plants are, you know when you can gather and hunt, you have a relationship with those plants and animals. And so you go from being super self-sufficient to living in a place where you don't know anything. You don't know what plants are edible. You don't know what plants will kill you. You don't know what plants can be used as medicine. You don't know all the animals or how they move and how the ecosystem works. It makes it really difficult to be and maintain our self-sufficiency. So another piece is this removing of food sources. So this was another strategy used by the federal government to try and force Plains tribes onto the reservations. They were having a really difficult time getting them to sign the treaties and agree to move to the reservations. And at one point there were, I think it was like around 1800, they estimated around 60 million buffalo that roamed the United States plains and down into the Southwest. And by 1895, there were less than 1,000. So this was a really intentional assault on Indigenous people's ability to be able to be self-sufficient. A lot of those tribes that followed the bison relied on them for food, shelter, clothing, all of those things. And suddenly that's gone. 60 million down to less than 1,000. So this, of course, forced a lot of tribes to have to sign treaties and to be moved onto the reservations. But once they get to the reservations, the conditions are really terrible. There's a lot of overcrowding, the food and annuities aren't coming, the payments, all of those things. There was a lot of corruption with the Indian agents that would dole out the resources and the money. And so a lot of people were literally starving to death, freezing to death, dying of illness. It was a horrible, horrible place to be. And even today, a lot of our Indigenous communities, you know, a lot of the reservations got placed in places where the land wasn't really great for growing, or they didn't have the minerals or water resources that other people wanted. And so they're not the prime chunks of land. So again, making it really hard to be self-sufficient. And then, of course, you know, we were talking a little bit before we started about how, you know, some of the true history of what happened regarding boarding schools in the United States, what that looks like. You know, I think it was last summer, there were these things coming out about the graves behind the boarding schools in Canada. And there was almost like this, I would hear people talk about it, almost like, look at what Canada did. And it was like, we did the same thing here. So this acknowledgement that these same practices happened here in the United States as well. And so boarding schools started around 1879 in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. That was the first boarding school. I've heard accounts of children as young as 3.5 years old being taken, removed to boarding schools. And a lot of times these schools were thousands of miles away. They were a long ways away because the goal of boarding schools was not education, it was assimilation. And I think another important thing to recognize is that forced assimilation is a form of genocide. You're literally trying to get rid of those cultural aspects, the sense of who people are. And the reason why they did this with children was because they weren't able to assimilate the adults very easily. There was such a clash in worldviews between what came over from Europe and the Indigenous worldviews of actually around the world, where we recognize the interconnection and everything, and we're part of the ecosystem. We are not above it. There's not a hierarchy in there. And so boarding schools were the way that they attempted to assimilate the children to be able to get rid of the Indian problem, so to speak. And so this is a direct quote from one of the guys that started the first school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. His name is General Richard Pratt. And the boarding schools are really modeled. This was a military person. He modeled them after the military. So he says, a great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. So boarding schools in the United States and Canada were oftentimes either government run or they were run by religious organizations and churches. And so this is a quote from a bishop in 1875 regarding the goal of residential school. And he says, we instill in them a pronounced distaste for the native life so that they will be humiliated when reminded of their origin. When they graduate from our institutions, the children have lost everything native except their blood. And when I read this, what percolated for me, if any of you have read any of the stuff Brene Brown does, her research on guilt and shame, we know that shame is very highly correlated with things like addiction, depression, suicide attempts, and guilt, the opposite of it. Guilt is something is bad, but I'm not bad myself. Shame is there's something wrong with me, right? So guilt is actually inversely correlated with that. So imagine generations upon generations of children being taught that who they are is wrong, is bad, is evil. So like this assimilation through humiliation, and it continues to have ripples out today in our communities. Fast forward, once the boarding schools were closed, the assimilation of our Indigenous children did not stop there. So there was this whole foster care, adoption care era from 1957 to 1967. It was in collaboration with the government and the League of Churches and a few other places. And during that time, over a third of Native children were removed from their homes, many without home visits, and they were adopted out to non-Native families. So again, this whole piece around assimilation continued to drive these policies with our Indigenous children. And even today in Minnesota, Native children are taken at a significantly higher rate than any other group in Minnesota. And I want to say it's like 7 or 9 times. It's significantly higher. It's not like just a little bit. It is significantly higher than any other group in this state. And so then the last piece I'll talk about is the Indian Relocation Act of 1956. And I think this is important too, to think about the timelines on these things. A lot of times when people talk about historical trauma, they think history, it happened a long time ago, but these didn't happen that very long ago. These things impacted my parents and my grandparents. So the Indian Relocation Act of 1956, when a lot of the treaties were signed, it was agreed that the government would uphold things like food and clothing and food and housing and education and healthcare for the people that remained on the reservation. So they thought, well, if we can get them off the reservation, then we don't have to uphold our treaty responsibilities anymore. So here you see a flyer, an actual flyer. It says, come to Denver, chance of a lifetime, good jobs, happy homes, training, beautiful Colorado. So there were 5 or 6 major cities across the United States, including Chicago, Denver, Oakland, where Indigenous people were moved to. They were given funds to be able to go to these large cities with the promise of jobs and housing and all these things that often were not available on the reservations. They had to often sign something saying they wouldn't return to their reservation, but once they got there was nobody to help them with any of that. So that's why today, you see a lot of Indigenous people residing off reservation and in large cities, but also large Native homeless populations. So those resources were not there. It was a big old lie, but it got a lot of Native people off the reservations, but they didn't have the resources necessarily to go back to their homes. And so this is another sort of term that Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart coined, historical trauma response. She says it's the constellation of features in reaction to this trauma, to historical trauma. It often includes things like depression, self-destructive behavior, suicidal thoughts and gestures, anxiety, low self-esteem, anger, and difficulty recognizing and expressing emotions. It may include substance abuse, although often in an attempt to avoid painful feelings through self-medication. And so another thing, I don't hear it nearly as much, but when I first started doing talks around ACEs and epigenetics about seven-ish years ago, once in a blue moon, somebody would say to me something like, well, that happened a long time ago. How come they don't get over it? But when you understand the science of epigenetics, it helps you understand why we don't just get over trauma. So epi means to sit on top of. So it's what sits on top of our genetic code. And I think maybe most of us are around the age where we remember really robust debates. Is it nature? Is it nurture? Like, what's most important? And like most things, it's both. It's both things that impact how we show up and the health and well-being that we have in our lifetime. And one of the things that's interesting too about this, and we like to sort of joke about this, although not joke and not in Indigenous communities, like as Anishinaabe people, we had a term for this. It was called blood memory. And so we already have this recognition that the experiences of our ancestors gets passed down to future generations, which is why you have all of these pieces around like, thinking 7 generations out and like being really aware of what we're doing, recognizing it's going to have an effect, down many generations down the line. And so epigenetics, it doesn't change our genetic code, but what it does is it turns on and turns off certain genes. It tells which genes should be read. And there was a epigenetic scientist who helped do one of the original studies, and he said it's sort of like, the periods and the commas and the semicolons and all of those things when you're reading a book, right? All of that matters. Like how it's punctuated determines how it's read. And so it's the same with epigenetics. Epigenetics acts as punctuation, so to speak, on the genetic code to say what's read and what isn't read. So just really quickly, one of the studies they did to really see like what is, or to understand epigenetics is they took the first generation of male mice. And what they would do is they would have them in these cages, and they would shock their feet. And every time they would they would infuse the scent of cherry blossom. So every time they did the scent, they would electrify the cage, shock the feet of the mice. So you do it enough times, an association is made between the smell and the pain. So they took that first generation and they actually took semen out of them and artificially inseminated the females because they didn't want any crossover in behaviors. They wanted to see straight up what was the genetic impact on this. So they took that second generation, the pups grew up, they didn't do anything to them, scent of cherry blossom, terrified response. They took the second generation, did the same thing, had pups in the third generation, let them grow up, didn't do anything to them. Fully grown, scent of cherry blossom, same terrified fear response. And there were actually more smell receptors in their nose for cherry blossoms, and there had been some changes in the brain. So we see some of these epigenetic changes can last multiple generations out. And I often ask, what do you think is the purpose of epigenetics? And it's the same purpose that a lot of things biologically, it has to do with survival, because that first generation might not be around to tell the second or third generation, hey, be careful of this, it can kill you, or it's really painful, or whatever it is. So when these messages can get passed down through the genetic code, sorry, that's my 4-year-old crawling around in the back. He's supposed to be napping right now. Okay, buddy, mommy's working right now.
Mom, I want to get
Sorry,
up.
just one. Sorry, my kids are home sick today. So
No problem.
yeah.
No problem. Yeah.
So it's like, okay, where was I at?
And Susan, you can take a little more extra time too. We're probably gonna not do the case study today, so you have time.
Okay, sounds
This
good.
is
Thanks,
great.
Jen.
Yes.
Let's see. So I have to
We were talking about the cherry blossom smell and it's protective.
yeah, because
Just
the
the
first generation
generation.
might not be around to tell future generations. I feel like there was something else I was gonna say about that, but it's gone. So I'll just continue on.
That they were forming the mice or rats in a certain way. Were you going to mention more about that? That just has its own complications. They took the semen out and injected
Yeah, I think it had something to do with what Dr. Diaz said about epigenetics. No, nope, that was something else.
You were saying the punctuation, and why would it? I don't know if we're gonna jog it, Susan.
I know.
It'll come to you later or tonight.
It will. I'll be on another slide. It'll be, wait, it's back.
Yeah.
Let's go back to epigenetics for a second. And so epigenetics is one of the ways that experiences can get passed down to future generations for the purposes of survival, right? Now, another way that trauma can get passed down is through intergenerational trauma. So that's how, like, the patterns and behaviors and those types of things that we have, how those things get passed down. And one of the things I think is important to recognize is that a lot of times the way that we respond to trauma when it's happening to us, especially when we're young, it's in an attempt to try and survive, right? So it wires our brain in a certain way. It wires our brain to think a certain way, to perceive a certain way, all of these things. So the purpose is our survival. But the problem is that when the situation isn't still dangerous, but we're still showing up with those unhealthy patterns, then we end up perpetuating those for future generations. So just like a really quick example would be, you know, my dad and my grandparents and my great grandparents who grew up with boarding schools, they didn't have a place to deal with big emotions of trauma as it was happening. And so they had to learn to shut that down. So when you shut down from that, that means that when you have a kid and your kid is having a big emotion, you don't know how to deal with that. So then you get angry or you shut down and disconnect from them, which then teaches that child that they need to shut down their emotions in order to stay in connection with you. So that's just a simple example of how these intergenerational patterns of trauma can get passed down into the next generation and become ACEs for the next generation. And so just taking a moment to sort of check in with your body, just noticing sensations right now, checking in with your thoughts and your emotions, because so much of this work is around building awareness. What's going on in me right now? What is it bringing up in me? And then also thinking about why do you think recognizing, and again, we just did hit the tip of the iceberg on this, but why do you think recognizing the experiences of Indigenous people in the United States is important either for your work or for your personal life? And if people want to unmute for a minute and or if they want to like plug something into the chat, that's great too. But I would just encourage you to think about that. And if you'd like to share what's coming up for you in this moment, I would love to hear it.
I think for me, it plays into how the dominant systems tend to blame the person for behaviors that are actually survival behaviors, and saying that somehow they're innately wrong or
something inherently wrong with them. Yeah.
Right. Rather than looking at what happened to the person or systematically, culturally, what happened to a group of people. So, yeah.
Thanks, Rebecca. And what that reminds me of, so a friend and a former colleague of mine, and unfortunately, I don't remember where this quote came from, but it really resonated with me. She said, this person, the quote was like, the ultimate sort of, I don't remember, the ultimate something of the oppressor is when they can remove their hands and say, look at what they're doing to themselves. Right? So like they've removed their hand and there's so much unresolved trauma that shows up as dysfunction in our communities that now it's like, oh, see, yeah, look, you know? And so I think that's such an important point that often we don't recognize, even within individuals, what those normal, natural trauma responses are, that they are something that all of us would, you know, experience ways of coping that might be really unhealthy if we don't, again, have those larger systems to help us be able to navigate whatever the trauma is. And so again, this is why historical trauma is different than just straight up intergenerational trauma or something like that, because you might still have a healthy community surrounding someone who's experiencing intergenerational trauma, and that will help offset the impacts of that trauma. But when the whole community is reeling from that trauma, then who holds the space for healing?
Susan, there's a few in the chat I can read because I know you have PowerPoint up.
Great. Yeah.
Jody says, I directly work with community members from the tribal nation of Grand Portage, and improving my understanding is vital to our improved systems change work in our community of Cook County at large.
Yeah. Thank you, Jody.
I just would like to share that I thought you beautifully wove the history in with the genetics piece, the epigenetics, and then sort of this intergenerational transmission of trauma. I mean, I thought the storytelling there was really compelling. I know you're not necessarily asking for presentation. I'm processing right now because that was a lot in a short time, but a lot of good food for thought. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So as usual, I put way too much into this presentation, so I'm glad I have extra time, but we're gonna go ahead and move into talking about sort of this higher overview of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And so when I first started doing ACEs presentations, the pyramid on the left is what we use, where it starts with adverse childhood experiences, which leads to social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, which leads to the adoption of health risk behaviors. And back when this study came out in the early 1990s, they didn't understand how these things connected. We understand much more today about how these things connect and impact one another. But then through the adoption of health risk behaviors, you have things like disease, disability, and social problems, and then even early death. And so a lot of the focus tends to be on those top three rungs of the pyramid. But without driving down into what's driving those top three parts of the pyramid. However, as some of us who are BIPOC, working in BIPOC communities, we were like, wait, we didn't start with ACEs in our community. It started with things like historical trauma. And so they've since added to the pyramid at the bottom. You can see on the right there, that generational embodiment and historical trauma, which leads to social conditions and local contexts that lead to things like complex trauma and adverse childhood experiences, which then leads to high allostatic load. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Disrupted neurodevelopment, which leads to coping mechanisms, which then leads to the burden of disease, disability, distress, criminalization, stigmatization, and potentially early death. And then you also have all of these things on the side, microaggressions, implicit bias, epigenetics, that also impact and play into this. So it can be very, very complex. One of the things, I just recently did a training with one of the original ACE study researchers, Dr. Anda, and one of the things he says that I think is really important though is this was the hypothesis of the ACE study, and this is actually what they found over and over. Many communities, many states have done ACEs studies since then. And so what he says is what's predictable is preventable. If we know this is the trajectory that unresolved trauma takes, if we can dig down and address some of those pieces at the bottom, then we don't have so many people going up the pyramid to, unhealthy coping mechanisms and disease and disability and criminalization and early death. So these are the original ACEs that were in the original ACE study. Three categories: abuse, neglect, household dysfunction. Under abuse, you have physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. Under neglect, physical and emotional neglect. And under household dysfunction, you have mental illness of a primary caregiver, incarceration of a relative, domestic violence, substance use issues, and divorce or separation, which really speaks to all the chaos and fighting that happens in a house when parents aren't getting along. Now, these are the original 10 chosen based on the literature at the time and what they were finding was most impactful. But the reality is there are far more ACEs than this. And there are some places that have included things like bullying or community violence or things like that, because all of the ACEs don't necessarily happen within a household. There are ways that they show up within society, within larger contexts as well. And so one of the important findings of the ACE study was what's called this dose-response relationship. So the more ACEs you have, the more likely you are to experience negative health outcomes, negative social outcomes, negative mental health outcomes. Now, this is really important. The ACEs study was an epidemiological study. So they're looking at the population. This is not a one-to-one. So if you've ever taken your ACE score or you're thinking about taking it, just because you have a high ACE score does not mean you are predetermined to have all of these problems and challenges. It just means that you are significantly more likely to. So there are a lot of other factors at play as well. But these are some of the ACE attributable problems or problems attributed to ACEs that they found in this study. So everything from behavior challenges, so substance use issues, missing work, lack of physical activity, and then mental and physical health challenges. So severe obesity, diabetes, depression, suicide attempts, STDs, heart disease, cancer, stroke, COPD, and broken bones. And so unresolved trauma and social outcomes. So again, this is that connection between unresolved trauma and coping mechanisms, use of substances. So studies have found a really high correlation between adverse childhood experiences and substance use issues. And also a lot of the studies that have looked at the prison population find that the prison population has a really high ACE score in general. So 97% of the prison population has at least one ACE. Another finding in the ACEs study was where there's one ACE, there tends to be more. So ACEs tend to sort of happen in groupings or in bunching. So it's very unusual for somebody to have just one ACE. So when you're looking at stats like this, when they say 1+ ACE, chances are it's significantly more than one. And so as I was sort of learning about all of this and doing my mind-body practice groups and things like that, I was still trying to understand, like, how do ACEs lead to these poor physical health outcomes? And when I started to understand what happens in the body when we have a stress response, it started really making sense for me. So thinking about the autonomic nervous system, which controls all sorts of things that, thank goodness, we don't have to remember, otherwise none of us would probably survive. So our heart rate, our blood pressure, our body temperature, our respirations, all of these things that help keep us alive happen automatically. They used to think, because it happened automatically, that we couldn't tap into it, but we know now that we can. And so the breath practice we started with is a great way to be able to tap into the autonomic nervous system. So with the nervous system, the autonomic, we have two main parts. We have the sympathetic nervous system, and that controls that fight or flight response. So thinking about that red area, right? That graph, green, red, blue, that's that red area. We move into that fight or flight response. It's essential for short-term survival. The other part of our nervous system, autonomic, is the parasympathetic nervous system. This controls rest and digest. It's essential for long-term survival, for our body to be able to heal, for our body to be able to digest food and pull the nutrients it needs. So both are essential for survival, and we need both working well. So when we think about moving into that red, a threat has been detected by the nervous system in some way, shape, or form. When that happens, a few important things happen in the body to prepare us to fight or to flee. One is we get a rush of adrenaline, which increases our respirations and our heart rate to get more oxygenated blood to the large muscle groups so we can run faster and fight harder. Blood vessels open up in some of the large muscle groups to allow more of that oxygenated blood in. So again, we can run faster, fight harder, but it's diverted from other parts of the body. So you might notice, if you're in fight or flight, you might notice cold, clammy hands or feet. That's because blood is getting pulled from the hands and moving to the torso and the large muscle groups for survival. Cortisol is also released in the body, which shuts down digestion. Digestion takes a ton of energy. If you don't survive this threat, digesting breakfast, lunch, or dinner doesn't matter. So the body prioritizes survival, shuts down digestion. We get a dump of glucose in our system, which of course our bodies use for energy to run faster, fight harder. And initially our immune system gets a bump, anticipating that we might be injured, bit, cut, whatever in the fight or the fleeing. But if we stay in that too long, then our immune system tanks, which we talked about that, Jen, after the end of a semester, right? Another thing that happens is your muscles get tense in an attempt to get ready to run or to flee. And our senses in this state get sharpened. So our pupils dilate to let in more light so we can see better. Our hearing gets more acute. And again, all of this is to try to increase our chances of survival. But when we can't run or we can't fight from it, or our sympathetic nervous system is stuck on too much, if my heart is having to work extra hard, that leads to things like heart attack and high blood pressure, stroke. Constant dump of glucose in our system can lead to type 2 diabetes. And also, like my dad, he was diabetic. And when he was really stressed out, it didn't matter what he ate, how much he exercised, he was constantly getting that glucose dump. So being able to manage your stress is super important for people who are diabetic.
And Susan, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I just want to leave a little time for the audience to interact with you. So just maybe 3 more minutes and then we'll have, okay, thank you.
Thank you. Inflammation in the body, digestive issues if you're constantly getting your digestion shut down, and autoimmune disorders. The other piece of it is the dissociative faint response. So with that, when you can't run, you can't fight, our brain actually releases endogenous opioids so that we don't feel the pain. It releases anesthetic neurochemicals, which numb the mind and the body. So our senses actually get less sharp. Our breathing and heart rate decreases. If our blood pressure drops too quickly, it can lead to the faint response, and our memory can be impacted. And so when we're in this state too much, it can lead to dissociative disorders, disconnection from body and disconnection from our emotions. One of the pieces I want to talk about really quickly is how the brain wires. So the brain wires through experience. Those things that we do over and over and over again get wired in really strongly, so they become automatic. We don't have to think about them. And I just want to share one really quickly. So if your arms are crossed, go ahead and uncross them, just shake them out a little bit, and then go ahead and cross your arms and notice which arm is on top, your right or left arm. And then we'll shake them out again, and then cross it so the other arm is on top. So I'm guessing maybe it feels uncomfortable, maybe you had to think about it, right? Because it's not automatic for most of us to cross our arms both ways. So I like to share that because I think anytime we're trying to do something new, to wire in something new, it's probably going to be uncomfortable. We're really going to have to think about it. We're going to have to be really intentional. That's part of how the brain wires. So sort of if we can like stick with it long enough, then pretty soon the new patterns become habits. They become automatic, and it becomes much easier for us. Our brain doesn't differentiate between physical and emotional pain. It processes it the same way. I won't get into the details on that, but thinking about resilience and the individual capabilities piece, I want to share a couple of things. So one is having a positive view. So positive view is really closely tied to hope. If we don't have a positive view and we don't have much hope, we're not likely to ask for help, because what's the point? Nothing's going to change anyway. A great way to build positive view is to have gratitude practices, building in self-efficacy, the belief that what I do matters is really important, and self-regulation practices and strategies. And so with that, we have neuroplasticity and the ability to wire in new patterns and pathways. These are some of and I can share like these slides in a PDF too, so you can send them out so people can see them. But these are some practices that help to regulate and organize the brain. So these are really, really important. And when I see this list, I see a lot of them as practices that Indigenous people have done for thousands of years. We have these practices in place to help us be able to regulate and to navigate and to move through big energy, emotion, and trauma. So I think I'm gonna leave there with the last piece. Just change requires consciousness and awareness. We cannot change what we're not aware of. And so practices that help us to have more awareness, mindfulness practices, body scans, those types of things can be really, really powerful tools for us. There's a podcast that we've created that goes into much more depth in a lot of these different pieces that I touched on. It's called Remembering Resilience. You can find it on Spotify. You can find it on Apple Music. If you just Google Remembering Resilience, blah, it should pop up there. I really apologize. I have a horrible habit of trying to put way too much in because I'm like, it's all important, right? But I hope that that the pieces made sense, even though I know I went through them really fast at the end. And I would welcome any conversations, anything at this time, questions. I don't know how you want to.
Yeah, I'll support that. I'll moderate that for you, Susan.
You.
But yeah, so Rebecca here, and thank you so much, Susan. Lots of food for thought. Gave me a lot of thought about trauma experiences in my past and my families and things like that. And I'm sure all of us are kind of connecting to it at different levels, whether it's intergenerational or historical trauma. But it's very important, the connection between the body and lived experience and history and all of that wrapped up together. So
Yeah.
I really appreciate that. And I think it was important that we take time for that. And I appreciate your talk, especially, you know, how stressful life is in general.
Yeah.
So folks, if you want to put questions in chat or unmute, we'll have a few minutes. You know, maybe we could hear from one person unmuting if they, you know, more of a speaker versus a chatter. And in chat, looks like people are just really appreciative of your talk.
Rebecca, I can get the ball rolling, but I would love for others. Susan, it was just a wealth of wonderful information, so much to think about. I really appreciate it. I'm kind of in processing mode, but since we have a group of early intervention providers here, and you did such a beautiful job of covering trauma, intergenerational trauma, so much to think about in terms of their work with children and families. If you can in some way connect it to the opioid epidemic or things we should be thinking about and working with families that are affected by or substance abuse in general, what might be some helpful things for us to know, just sort of connecting the dots?
Yeah, so a lot of the work that I've also done has been running things like mind-body medicine groups, teaching practices and skills, learning how to be with big emotions, because so often that's what's happening. People are using substances to cope with these big, overwhelming emotions that they don't know what to do with. And so that's also why I like to share the researcher that shared with me at a conference that the brain doesn't know the difference between physical and emotional pain. Opioids work really good for pain, right? And so when we think about a lot of the emotional, I would say in general, as a society, we tend to give more credibility to physical pain than emotional pain, right? And so, and you can see that even in like, we cover physical health things, but mental health things aren't covered in the same way. But mental health often has to do with the inability to deal with these big emotions. So, so recognizing that the brain doesn't know the difference, I think as a society, we have a lot of work to do to provide more supports and resources for people to be able to deal with the big emotions that are coming up, so it doesn't get stuck in their physical body, in their mental models and mind, in their, you know, just their sense of emotion. So, when I think about how does all of this connect, it really goes back to, we need to be teaching more skills for people to identify emotions, practices for being able to move through big emotions, in addition to providing supports. I know even myself, sometimes I do tons of meditation and practices myself, but there are still times where I feel really overwhelmed and I need that sort of like external co-regulation in the moment, right? We are social creatures designed to be in relationship with one another. So this sort of like, well, here, you deal with your stuff is really disingenuous, because we all impact one another. Our energies impact one another. And so I think being able to create more of those spaces as well for people that feel safe, for people to be able to come in and to be able to help teach co-regulation and teach regulation skills, I think is really important.
Thank you so much, Susan. I think you hit it right on the head that our energies intermix and that they impact us definitely at a physical level. So Jen, would you like to talk about a email they should be expecting for our feedback? Thank you, Susan. Wonderful, and hope we can have you back in the future.
I love that. Thank you.
Susan, first I'll start. Thank you so much. Just wonderful information, so much to think about. We would love to have you back for part 2.
I would love to do
We would love to have you back.
Resilience, like really dig in, teaching practices. I would absolutely love that. Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. That's such a wonderful presentation. Yes, I will pivot to something a little more mundane, but my thoughts are still with that great presentation. Thank you everyone for being and Susan, you're getting a lot of kudos and thanks in the chat. I hope you can see it when we're done.
Yeah, thank you.
But on to the mundane logistics that I will pivot to. Everyone, thank you for listening. Thank you for being a great audience. You'll receive an email to complete the REDCap survey about this session. You need to complete that to get your certificate of participation. And at the end of the sessions or the end of the series, we'll send a certificate of participation after you complete the feedback surveys. So thank you so much. This was a great presentation. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful week and a great weekend too. Take care, and we hope to see everyone next week. Thanks.
And I see a great comment in chat too, and we can bring that up in our discussion next week. And I hope everyone can join us next week.
Thank you
Thank you, Susan.
Yeah, thank you. Have a great day,
Thank you
everyone.
so much. I hope
Susan.
everyone. Great. And Mary Jo's putting some great resources that we will make sure to capture and send out including the podcast and the opioid addiction treatment videos on the extension website.